Hello and welcome back to episode 21 of the Ideal Nutrition podcast. Today we're going to do another kind of bit of interview format. So like a few episodes back, or quite a few episodes back, we did one on collagen where Leah interviewed me. So to kind of make up for that one, we're going to go the other end of the spectrum and do a topic that Leah is far more well-versed than I am. And we're going to be talking about nutritional considerations for plant-based athletes. So this is something that I've always, my personal thoughts is that I think you can do a plant-based diet just as well as an omnivorous diet. You can get pretty much everything you need for optimal performance through that. But there are challenges associated with that, particularly under very specific circumstances. So we'll kind of talk through those kind of things today, really. So starting off with like, what are some of those common challenges that plant-based athletes face?
We definitely face very specific challenges being on a plant-based diet and trying to have these athletic or performance goals. I'd say there's probably three main ones. The first is going to be protein intake. So whilst a lot of vegans are like, you don't have to worry about protein intake, like we'll get enough. I think that's true for the general population. I think, it's easy to meet kind of like your protein requirements for general health and well-being on a vegan diet. But when we're thinking about the protein requirements for athletes and how big they are, it can be a lot more difficult to meet those on a plant-based diet. So that is absolutely one where I will rarely ever find, like if people come to me and they're a plant-based athlete, I think I've had a very small handful actually meeting their protein requirements on a consistent basis. It would be like less than 5 for sure. And I work with predominantly plant-based people, so it's a very small percentage.
Yeah, let's start with that. So like, even like on an omnivorous diet, like that's a challenge for a lot of people.
Of course.
There's a bit of a culture that particularly amongst dietitians actually, but like where people talk about this concept of like the Western world over consumes protein. And like as a portion or a percentage of total calories and stuff like that, firstly, that's a low percentage of our calories. We have a large percentage coming from fat and carbs to start off with, just a general population. But like general health, we don't really need that high of a protein intake. But when we're talking athletes, it does get higher. And even like amongst powerlifters and stuff like that, I see like it's still something that needs to be focused on to make sure you're reaching those targets. I'll start with a few questions. So one of them I want to go with is like, do you change what you'd call the evidence-based range of protein for plant-based athletes?
I do, and I actually increase it, which makes it even a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So we do know that the digestibility and like the amino acid profile of plant-based proteins are not as suited to muscle building as your animal-based proteins. So usually if you're having plant-based proteins, you're not digesting as much of that protein as you would be as if you were having, say, steak. So like tofu versus steak. And even a better example would be like legumes, which have quite a low digestibility at times compared to steak. So I say that generally you need at least kind of 10 to 20% more protein on a vegan diet than a non-vegan diet. So from the perspective of even like working with all my plant-based powerlifters and people in the strength space, I want them to have at least 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight at a minimum.
Yeah.
Where if I'm working with someone who's not plant-based, maybe we have a little bit more leeway in going like 1.8. But yeah, we definitely need more in a vegan diet.
Yeah. So like, what I see that being a lot easier when you're on higher calories. So like one of the biggest challenges, this doesn't cover all plant-based sources, but it's like most plant-based sources will have more carbs or fat than protein. So let's start with that before we go into the next thing I want to talk about.
Sure.
Like exceptions to that kind of general rule, like what options would you go with that are not higher in carbs and fat than protein?
I talk a lot about protein efficiency, and I think it's definitely something I'll talk about more often from a plant-based perspective, because a lot of our protein sources are not efficient. And talking about efficiency in terms of how many grams of protein you're getting per 100 calories. So my idea of an efficient source of protein would be anything where they had at least 12 grams of protein per 100 calories. If we're thinking animal-based food, that's actually quite low. So compared that to chicken, which I couldn't actually. It's almost
like
head. But it would be like 20.
Yeah, it's a bit over 20. Yeah,
it'd be about 20. There's nothing that comes to mind as a plant-based protein that is quite that efficient. So that's why there is that struggle in reaching your protein intake, particularly if you have some kind of calorie deficit or your calories are low.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to go into next. So like calorie surplus, protein starts to become a smaller percentage to get to that, say, 2 grams per kilogram body weight. Going to a maintenance calories becomes a little bit harder, but still pretty manageable, particularly if you're quite active and stuff like that, higher calorie needs. But if you go into a calorie deficit, so like a problem that I've always kind of seen and a challenge associated with that is like, there's this paper by Eric Helms on like when you're in a big calorie deficit or you're getting quite lean or you're prepping for a bodybuilding show. And the range he talks about is 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, which is almost all of your mass if you're that lean.
Yes.
And so it's even higher than the 2 grams in that case. And if you then also look at it from the logic of being like, well, somebody who's plant-based, we might even go a little bit higher. How do you get around that problem?
It's a very difficult question, because I think sometimes you just have to go, okay, in this particular scenario, a plant-based diet is not going to be, that's not going to be feasible to get like say 3 grams of protein per kilo of fat-free mass. You may just not be able to get there. You can do things like just focusing on your really efficient sources of proteins, or things like your soy-based foods, textured vegetable protein, tofu, and things like that. But sometimes it's just not feasible. I've definitely come across athletes who are on like 16 to 1800 calories in a calorie deficit, but their protein requirements are 150 plus grams. That doesn't always work out on a plant-based diet, so you kind of just have to take the loss sometimes. I'd say it's pretty rare that I do that, like I undercut protein.
Yeah.
But it happens sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, and like that's also like, honestly, that is how I work with a lot of my clients. If they're doing that, like even though I'm like, well, theoretically protein needs should be a little bit higher, maybe could be a little bit higher, I do undercut it sometimes in those circumstances, because it's just like, it's quite unrealistic. The way around that I see some athletes using is just a ton of protein powder.
Yes, which I do not recommend on a plant-based diet. I mean, I don't recommend it in general. Like, you can use it, but I usually say, like, max protein powder that I want someone using is like 2 scoops a day, or like 60 grams. I think if more of your protein is coming from protein powder than whole foods, and you're really missing out on your micronutrients, and that's when you have high risk of iron deficiency and all of those other things that are in our protein foods. And like
particularly while calorie restricted, and it's harder.
Calorie restricted, and as a vegan, where you have higher needs of some of those minerals as well.
Yeah, so that is a hard one, because I do see people do it, but that is something that really... is a challenge. Lower calories, harder to get stuff in. Yeah, interesting.
And it kind of sucks too, having a lot of protein powder and not a lot of whole foods. So it's just never a fun time.
Yeah. And we've spoken about this a few times, but like in case this is the first time somebody listens to this podcast, if you're looking for a plant-based protein powder, what would you be looking for?
So I usually recommend 2 options. The first, and is like my gold standard option, is going to be your Soy Protein Isolate, because we know like the anabolic effect of Soy Protein Isolate is very similar to whey. Mm-hmm. So because it's so close, it's a good win for us to kind of go for the Soy Protein Isolate. But some people have reservations around having too much soy, and the research around that is vast. So we won't go into that rabbit hole, but for some people it's easier to go, let's just go another option. And in which case I'd go like a pea and rice protein blend. So we know that protein from legumes and protein from grains are complementary in their amino acid profile. So whilst just having pea or just having like a brown rice protein wouldn't be a very complete amino acid profile, together they make a somewhat complete, almost, amino acid profile.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I do actually want to touch on the soy aspect. So like, I know like, so like for everyone listening, like right now Leah is writing a blog post on soy and how that affects things, and it is a deep rabbit hole. Yeah. What I actually want just from you right now though is like brief thoughts, like how much soy is okay for somebody striving to optimize athletic performance in general, and even just maybe touch on the health aspect as well.
Yeah, so we do know, like based on the research that I've come across and the systematic reviews out there, that there is no one huge issue with having a lot of soy in your diet. Like, it's not like, oh, soy definitely causes feminization effects in men. Like, we don't have research to say that, or that it even really changes estrogen levels in men. And there is research to say that the phytoestrogen in soy is protective against a few things. There's things like breast cancer in women, prostate cancer in men, potentially. Evidence is kind of murky still. The only time I suppose I am mindful of having too much soy is if a woman is looking at you getting pregnant in terms of fertility. So from what I can understand, having soy in your diet does seem to improve rates of fertility to a certain point. And then when you get to really, really high intakes of the phytoestrogens in soy, it can potentially start to have the opposite effect and reduce fertility. So again, we don't have hard evidence on that or exactly how much soy that is, but there was one systematic review that said that having over 100 milligrams of soy isoflavones is probably not recommended if you're trying to get pregnant. And that would be equal to like 4 to 5 serves of soy in a day.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. And like something that I've heard, and I haven't looked into this one too closely, but like my understanding is like the estrogen in men kind of thing stems from like a case study. And there's obviously heaps of research on this, but like it stems from a case study where somebody had like 3 liters of soy milk per day for a long period of time.
Yeah, in Men's Health magazine. It was like in 2009 and it just went off like wildfire.
Yeah.
But yeah, this guy was having 3 liters of soy a day, and it was a case study, and it was allegedly like due to the soy intake, but yeah, it's a bit misleading, I think.
Yeah, and even if that was something that kind of translates to like practicality, if it was done in a larger sample size, in control setting, all those kind of things, it still kind of comes back to one of the things you said where it's like low to moderate intake's probably fine from what I understand.
It's probably even good for us.
Yeah.
If anything, it's just, there might be a level where it's no longer good for us and starts going in the other direction. But I would say, looking at the research, that amount of soy is quite high. Like you'd have to have a lot, and you'd have to start displacing other foods. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and like the only reason I kind of wanted that is that example of people who like go really deep into one thing, like the protein powder thing is an example where it's like doing one thing like that and just having heaps of that as a way to get their protein in could potentially lead to that kind of thing where you're like, 3 liters of soy milk per day. Like,
yeah, you could get up to that level.
Yeah. All right, cool. So what are other challenges that plant-based athletes would face?
So, coming off protein and not being able to maybe get quite enough while you're in a calorie deficit, there's also, can you get enough calories on a plant-based diet to meet high energy requirements? Because a lot of the food on a plant-based diet is going to be really high fiber, kind of lower calorie, not very energy dense. Great for dieting for people wanting to lose weight and manage appetite. Maybe a barrier for athletes who have really high energy requirements and need to eat a lot. Like you even see this in non-vegan people trying to eat predominantly whole foods, like healthy, nutritious diet whilst trying to bulk, or if they've just got really high energy requirements, it can be difficult. But then imagine all of your food is super, super high fiber and satiating.
So let's touch on the fiber bit later because there's heaps I want to talk about with that.
Yeah.
So like with the like getting enough calories in, something that's obviously fascinating is that like people talk about it heaps and they make jokes about how you can have unhealthy vegan foods. Like you can get calories in.
Yeah.
But like a lot of people, not all of them, but like a lot of people who are plant-based are also health conscious or more health conscious than the average person and probably don't want to go too far down that route. So say you come to somebody who is plant-based, quite health conscious, and they want to get more calories in and they've been struggling for a long time on their own. Is there any strategies you'd really look at as like first options or anything like that?
It depends on the person, but I look at their fiber intake initially, and if it's around that kind of 70 to 90 grams per day, which is common, I see that a lot. My first thing is like, okay, how can we strategically reduce this fiber intake whilst maintaining the quality of their diet and their protein? So yes, I guess you could have a bunch of things like mock meats and vegan junk food, but that's going to make it really hard to meet your protein requirements because unlike a lot of non-plant-based foods, those all tend to be super low protein options. So you can't just like go out and have McDonald's. Like all of our fast food, junk food options are going to be low protein. So there's that. But I usually go for trying to reduce fruit and veg intake to a moderate level, because sometimes that can be
Quite
really
high.
high in
Yeah.
vegans, almost, too much to meet their actual requirements for other food groups. And I'd also look at replacing some of their whole grains with more refined grains. So if they're having like a bunch of, if they're having like rye bread, maybe it makes sense to move to a white bread with a lower fiber content, or using low fiber cereals like Nutri-Grain as one of my favorites, as opposed to like Wheat Bix, and just strategically trying to reduce that overall fiber intake.
Yeah, for sure. Which like it does tie into the next thing that we're going to talk about in terms of like gastrointestinal issues. So like it's something I see really commonly where people who eat exclusively plant-based, often partly because they have really high fiber intake, and maybe FODMAPs we can talk about as well, because like those it's in the same kind of category to a certain degree, causing the same issues. Commonly getting gastrointestinal issues. What's your way around that with plant-based athletes? Even like to the point where like, because that could affect performance too. Like this is not just a quality of life, it can affect performance. So how would you work around that?
Once again, it kind of goes back to the fiber intake. Like in strategically reducing that fiber intake to a more manageable level, so say 40 to 50 grams as opposed to 60 to 90 grams per day, I often always see an immediate reduction in symptoms. Like it's a no-brainer. We could also do things like moving to more liquid calories, a bit easier to digest and get more food volume in an easy way. And that sometimes helps. And really focusing on chewing very fibrous foods well. But nothing moves the needle more than just reducing fiber intake.
Yeah. And going to FODMAPs as well, because you've mentioned in the past it's a bit of a struggle to do that one. And I can see why it would be a struggle. It's not quite as bad as I hear people going like keto vegan. Like that's very, very restricted. But like FODMAPs on a plant-based diet would be a struggle.
Yeah.
Do you still manipulate stuff with that? Like do you still play around with FODMAP stuff?
If the fiber stuff doesn't alleviate enough of the symptoms, I'll go into the FODMAP stuff a little bit more and just start replacing some of their daily food items with a low FODMAP option and start taking out really, really high FODMAP options. And that sometimes helps, but still, like if you have really high food intake from high energy requirements and it's all plant-based food, and we know that all plant-based food has some level of FODMAPs in it. Yeah. You are going to be eating a lot of FODMAPs in general. So if you have IBS, that can be a real challenge.
Yeah.
But sometimes manipulating those things just a little bit helps enough.
Yeah, cool. And then the last thing I was kind of thinking about as well is that, like, it's something that I overlook very often because I want to go to more advanced stuff, but like little things like chewing slower and stuff like that, like particularly like legumes and stuff like that. That would be a thing. Is there any other easy wins? Is there anything you got to say about that? I don't know.
In practice, the only thing that has really moved the needle is reducing fiber intake. Like I've tried a number of things, like playing with FODMAPs, probiotics, chewing foods really well, moving to, I guess, more things like tofu instead of like whole soybeans that are like more fibrous. But yeah, nothing's going to improve it more than just bring down that fiber intake in total.
Yeah, cool. Is there anything else you can think of, any other challenges, any other easy wins that you see as common for vegan athletes or plant-based athletes?
I think the biggest things I would always suggest to plant-based athletes is, use really efficient sources of protein. Make sure you're getting enough calories because it's very easy to underfuel on a plant-based diet. Like that's quite common to people just to be undercutting themselves in that way. And to utilize more processed foods where you can. I find a lot of vegans are like, I don't want to use Nutri-Grain because it has a fair bit of sugar. It's not a lot of fiber. And I'm like, you need sugar and you don't need the fiber. So it's actually the perfect option for you. So I'd say try to get out of that mentality if you're struggling with these things, and introduce more of those slightly more processed foods. Yeah,
it's pretty counterintuitive, but like when you're really far at one end of the spectrum, like moving back towards the other end of the spectrum can help a little bit.
Totally.
One thing that I have forgotten to ask, because like it's something that I'm actually a bit more familiar with this, but like it can't be missed in this podcast really, is micronutrients. So obviously there's certain micronutrients that are harder to get, and you've probably answered this question so many times in your life, but like what micronutrients matter and should you be aware of, pay attention to, and how would you go about addressing those?
Yeah, so I just talking about vegans in general or people on a plant-based diet, B12 is a massive one. So if you're, like, it's a non-negotiable for me. If you're on any kind of plant-based diet, wherever you are on the spectrum and you're cutting out animal foods, take a B12 supplement. We know that B12 really is only found in animal foods, and the ones in plant-based foods, like you can find it in nutritional yeast and some mushrooms and some fortified foods, but you'd have to be so mindful about your intake that it becomes really hard to hit that consistently. And then
cutting in on that one, like how long does it take, like if somebody switches vegan and they have no intake, how long does it take before it like starts to affect, I don't know, energy?
It takes a long time, to be honest. To develop a B12 deficiency can take a couple of years of being vegan with no supplementation. So I'll quite often see people who are getting their blood test done. They're not taking a B12 supplement. They're like, oh, my B12's always been fine. Like, oh, how long have you been vegan? They're like, oh, like, when was your last blood test? Like, oh, I've been vegan for like a year. I'm like, okay, yeah, because your B12 is probably really high and it's slowly come down over this time. So, in a couple of years, you're probably going to be deficient if you're not
It's like guaranteed. It's just guaranteed.
It's guaranteed. Unless you're having like ungodly amounts of nutritional yeast in your diet.
Yeah.
You need a B12 supplement.
Yeah.
And the reason I push that so much with my clients is that it's not like iron deficiency where you're feeling fatigued and there's all these like ramifications, but there's not really a super long-term consequence. B12, if you're B12 deficient for long enough, you are going to experience things like long-lasting nerve damage and brain damage.
That scares me.
That's so scary. There's irreversible consequences of B12 deficiency. So 100% non-negotiable.
All right, well then, other micronutrients?
Yeah, so there's so many. But the next probably important one would be iron. That would come up a lot. So, iron deficiency is something I see a lot in practice, and it can be really difficult, particularly for people with a menstrual cycle, to get enough iron on a plant-based diet. So iron requirements are about 1.8 times the amount on a vegan diet as opposed to when you're eating animal products. So not only are the sources of, your predominant iron sources lower in iron than animal foods, but you also need a lot more iron.
Yeah.
So you've got these like competing things that makes it really difficult to meet your requirements. Some people can just focus on getting enough iron-rich foods in their diet and doing things like pairing it with vitamin C-rich foods to boost absorption and whatnot. But I do often put people on kind of lower dose iron supplements just to supplement their diet, particularly if they have menstrual cycle.
Yeah. Makes it easy. It's hard to get, like, a lot of women struggle to get enough iron anyway.
Yes.
So it's like you add this burden on top of it, and it's a challenge.
It's really difficult to do consistently. And then I definitely use that kind of iron supplementation if there's also a calorie deficit on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Do you want to quickly list off, there's one other question I've got to ask. Do you want to quickly list off any other nutrients?
Yeah, so let's just quickly go through the rest. Like zinc is definitely one, particularly when it comes to men. Like we know men have quite high zinc requirements as opposed to women, and zinc requirements are about 1.5 times the amount on a vegan diet as opposed to non-vegan diet. And there's actually not a lot of plant-based foods that are like super rich in zinc. So that's one that may need supplementing or particular attention paid to it. And then you've also got smaller things like selenium and iodine and vitamin D and things that are more difficult to get on a plant-based diet, which depending on the individual might need attention as well.
Yeah, cool. The only other question I've got, because I heard you say this on another podcast, I'd never really thought about it too hard before this, but like what's the difference between vegan and plant-based?
Oh yeah, so it's mainly just like the ethics surrounding it. So a plant-based diet is just that. It's a diet. So it's when you're eating predominantly plant-based like foods and very few animal products. Vegan kind of comes into this ethical spectrum where it's more or less a lifestyle and based around your opinions on like animal cruelty and the environment. So vegans will be very strict in the fact that they don't have any animal products whatsoever. And that'll also extend to things in their household, like not being tested on animals and their clothes not being made from like wool and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So one's a diet and one's more or less like a ethical thing.
Yeah, like that kind of blew my mind to hear that. I don't know how common knowledge that is, but like it was probably like a year or two ago that you said that. And I was like, it's crazy that I'd been a dietitian before that.
Yeah.
And not like I knew a little bit of it, but like I just like kind of like use vegan as a cover-all term, being like if you don't eat any meat, dairy, eggs, etc., like that's vegan. And then there's like a different level of vegan for like the other ethical stuff as well.
Right,
like I always thought it was like vegan for, and I don't know if I'm
vegan level 1 or vegan level 2.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if I'm sounding like an idiot by saying that, but like, and like I'd always viewed plant-based, and like plant-based is obviously a much broader term. You can be predominantly plant-based. You can be, there's a spectrum there. But it's really interesting just like thinking through that. So I was like, worth sharing in case I'm not the only person who did not know that.
Totally.
Cool. Okay, well, that will wrap up episode 21 of the podcast. So thank you to everybody who has listened, and I hope you enjoyed it.